Before you were born, long before bottled water and kitchen taps, people drank things that would terrify you today. Imagine waking up thirsty and knowing your local river was full of animal waste, dead fish, and whatever your neighbor dumped in last night. No filters, no boiling kettles, no backup plan. Yet somehow, medieval people didn't just survive, they lived full lives, worked long days, raised children, and traveled across continents, all while drinking liquids we would never dare to touch. So what was their secret? Did they really drink beer all day? Were they constantly surrounded by disease, or did their bodies become stronger than ours? And how did entire civilizations stay hydrated without ever tasting clean water? Tonight, we're going to slow down, step back in time, and quietly examine the surprisingly clever, and sometimes shocking, ways medieval people kept themselves alive. One cup at a time, settle in. Take a sip of something safe. And let's begin. Chapter 1. When you imagine medieval life, you might picture swords, castles, and the occasional dragon-shaped weather vane wobbling in the wind. But before villagers could worry about knights or taxes or which saint's relic might cure their back pain, they first had to answer a much more pressing question. What exactly should they drink without dying? To you, in the modern world, hydration is an easy affair. You reach for a glass, turn a tap, and instantly receive treated, pressurized water that has passed through pipes, filters, and enough regulations to fill an entire parchment roll. But if you were standing in a muddy English village in the 13th century, surrounded by grazing livestock, compost heaps, and neighbors who believed bathing was a slippery moral slope, that sparkling glass would be a fantasy bordering on sorcery. The medieval world was built around liquids, but rarely around pure water. Instead, people navigated a complicated web of weak ale, watered wine, boiled broths, herb-infused tonics, and carefully guarded wells, each chosen not for taste, but for survival. To understand this, you must first set aside your assumptions about hydration as a refreshing experience, and instead think of it as a kind of daily medical negotiation. Every sip was a small risk. Every jug was a gamble between thirst and disease, so imagine yourself waking up inside a typical medieval home. Not the house of a noble with stone walls and a polished copper basin, but a peasant dwelling in rural France with packed dirt floors, a thatched roof occasionally shedding straw into your breakfast, and chickens roaming freely, unaware of social boundaries. You begin your day not with coffee or tea, neither existed for you yet, but with whatever liquid solution your household had prepared the previous night. More often than not, this meant small beer. Despite its name, small beer was not for taverns, nor for rowdy celebrations. It was the water of the Middle Ages, brewed from the same grains used for larger beers. It was light, weak, usually 1 to 2% alcohol at most, and consumed by men, women, and children alike. It was not meant to delight. It was meant to kill microbes, even if no one yet understood microbes. They only knew that boiled, fermented water was less likely to cause stomach pain, diarrhea, or death. Many families brewed their own beer at home, not as hobbyists, but as hydration manufacturers. The process involved boiling grain mash, fermenting it in wooden tubs, and reusing the same ingredients multiple times, extracting weaker batches with each rinse. The first brew would be strong ale, sometimes reserved for feast days or rent payments. The second brew, much weaker, was daily fare. By the third brew, it might barely resemble beer and had the consistency of breakfast cereal runoff. Yet, still, it was safer than water scooped straight from a ditch or pond. If you were lucky enough to live near a communal well, perhaps protected by stone walls and blessed by the local priest, your chances of drinking fresh water increased slightly. But even wells were vulnerable. Surface runoff, nearby latrines, and dead rodents falling into the darkness all contributed to contamination. People knew water could sicken them. Chroniclers warned against foul standing water, describing it as slimy, ill-favored, or breeding fevers. And yet, water could not be fully avoided. Farmers sweating in fields beneath a July sun, laborers hauling stones for cathedral foundations, and shepherds guiding flocks across barren hills, all needed something light enough to consume in large quantities. Ale helped, but even ale was not always plentiful. Grain shortages, failed brews, or taxation could reduce supply, leaving villagers to improvise. In wine-producing regions like Italy, Spain, and southern France, the solution was posca, a weak mixture of wine diluted heavily with water, sometimes flavored with honey or herbs. Originating from Roman soldiers, posca persisted through the medieval era as a cheap, disinfected beverage. Its acidity inhibited bacterial growth, making it safer than plain water while stretching limited wine supplies. Monasteries, on the other hand, developed more elaborate hydration strategies. Monks were known to keep careful ration records of every liquid consumed. Some monasteries allowed up to 5 pints of ale per monk per day, according to the rule of Saint Benedict, though this measurement varied widely by region. Monastic water sources were often carefully managed, featuring stone-lined cisterns, sand-filtering basins, and rainwater channels. It was not uncommon for monasteries to build their own brewhouses, run by lay brothers assigned to cellarer duties, ensuring a constant supply of drinkable liquid for prayerful mornings and contemplative afternoons. Herbal remedies also entered the hydration system. Women, particularly those managing households, were skilled in making infusions of mint, sage, chamomile, and rosemary, all believed to refresh the body or cool the humors. Unlike ale or wine, these drinks were light, non-alcoholic, and often boiled, making them among the safest forms of water ingestion, provided someone had access to herbs and firewood. Firewood itself was a limiting factor. Boiling water required fuel, and in many regions, wood was precious, reserved for heating, bread ovens, or metalwork. To boil water purely for drinking could be seen as luxurious or wasteful. This is why broths, made by simmering bones, vegetables, or scraps in water, often served as dual-purpose hydration and nourishment. In colder climates like Scandinavia, residents used melted snow or ice, often filtered through cloth or moss, but rarely drunk raw. Instead, people commonly poured hot broth over snow, creating a primitive rehydration soup, or melted ice into ale, stretching scarce supplies. Yet perhaps the most overlooked liquid of the medieval world was whey, the leftover fluid from cheese-making. In dairy-heavy regions like Switzerland or the Alps, whey was consumed daily, sometimes fermented into a drink called milk wine. It was light, slightly sour, and filled with electrolytes, making it unexpectedly similar to modern sports drinks, though no knight would ever call it that. Slowly, through trial, error, and quiet domestic experimentation, the people of the Middle Ages developed a layered system of hydration without ever formally describing it. Each region relied on its most abundant resource, ale in grain-rich England, wine-diluted water in Mediterranean villages, herb infusions in rural farmsteads, broths in colder climates, whey in dairy pastures, rainwater collection in rooftops and barrels, especially during summer droughts. Even in urban centers like Paris or London, where rivers doubled as sewers, people recognized the need to interact carefully with water. Many households preferred to draw from upstream, often walking longer distances to avoid polluted channels. Medieval sanitation was far from modern standards. Yet people were not ignorant of contamination, only limited by resources. You may still wonder, if they did not understand microbiology, how did they know which liquids were safe? The answer lies not in scientific comprehension, but in generational experience, passed down quietly through ritual, proverb, and habit. Mothers warned children not to drink from stagnant puddles, not because of germ theory, but because they had watched neighbors fall ill. Brewers skimmed scum off boiling vats, unaware they were removing harmful bacteria. Priests blessed wells, believing holy words could drive away plague demons, yet in some cases, their rituals included cleaning debris and circulating water, accidentally improving sanitation. So, if you were transported back to the medieval world and handed a cup, you would not ask, "Is this refreshing?" You would ask, "Has this been boiled? Has it been fermented? Has it come from a flowing source? Was it blessed? And perhaps most importantly, does the person offering it look healthy?" Even so, risk was constant. Hydration was a daily test of memory and trust. But if almost everything was tainted, you might still ask, how did medieval people manage to avoid constant illness? And what happened when all their careful strategies failed? Chapter 2. If the people of the Middle Ages built their lives around fermented safety and boiled caution, then nothing was more feared than water gone wrong. When hydration failed, it did not merely inconvenience a village, it unraveled households, paralyzed farms, and filled churchyards with quiet funerals. And yet, strangely, no one ever blamed the water directly. They blamed the air, the stars, the sins of their neighbors, or unbalanced bodily humors, but rarely the liquid itself. They lived in a world where contamination was understood by observation, but misinterpreted by theory. A monk might warn that foul vapors rose from swamps to harm the lungs, but he would not say tiny organisms were swimming in the cup beside him. So what happened when someone ignored the rules, when they drank from a ditch, scooped from a flooded river, or filled their jar from stagnant town runoff? They fell ill, often with what medieval writers broadly called flux. To you, that word is imprecise. To them, it was sufficient. Flux could mean diarrhea, dysentery, cholera-like outbreaks, or general stomach torment. Physicians of the time described it in delicate euphemisms, calling it a loosening of the bowels or wet purging from within. In England, monks recorded outbreaks of bloody flux, likely dysentery, ravaging entire monasteries. A chronicle from St. Alban's Abbey noted that the brothers took to their privies more than to their prayers. In urban Paris, municipal ordinances warned citizens not to dump fish guts into riverbanks, not out of hygiene concerns, but because the smell offended the nobility. Sanitation laws existed, surprisingly, but they were rarely enforced for public safety. A London regulation in the 14th century stated that butchers must not clean carcasses in the main river, yet the same river remained a common place to wash chamber pots and rinse laundry. Civic authorities complained about filth, but clean water was not expected, only less inconvenience. Still, when illness struck, people responded with ritual, remedy, and resignation. If you were wealthy, a merchant, landowner, or low-ranking noble, you might summon a physician trained in Galenic theory, who would prescribe hydration through carefully measured liquids designed to rebalance your internal humors. Perhaps warm wine mixed with cinnamon, or diluted vinegar infused with sage, or milk boiled with honey and pepper, depending on whether you were deemed too cold, too wet, or too dry inside. If you were poor, a laborer, field hand, or tenant farmer, you relied on local healers, usually older women with inherited knowledge. They might boil barley water, mix mint with goat's milk, or prepare thin porridge mixed with crushed fennel, believing coating the stomach soothed internal burning. Some administered ground eggshell mixed with vinegar to dry the humors. The science was wrong. The hydration was right. And so, many survived. Not all regions suffered equally. Rural communities with access to streams, forests, and livestock often had better hydration outcomes than city dwellers surrounded by pollution. If you lived in a mountain village in the Pyrenees, you could drink from snowmelt streams, provided your herd was not fouling it upstream. If you lived in Florence, you could fetch from the Arno, but likely after walking upstream beyond the fishmongers' stalls and dye merchants. Social class determined not only what you drank, but how confidently you could drink it. A castle lord had access to private wells lined with stone, often shielded by iron grates to keep animals and thieves away. Some noble households employed water tasters, servants who sipped before the lord did, a precaution borrowed from poison prevention, but equally effective against bad water. Monasteries managed similar precautions through hierarchical systems. The cellarer, responsible for provisioning, monitored liquid supplies with almost religious zeal. Monks recorded the volume of ale consumed per person per day, often adjusting for season or fasting schedule. In stricter orders, such as the Cistercians, wine was forbidden, forcing monks to rely entirely on ale, herb waters, and broths. Some monasteries even built pipelines, hollowed logs connected end to end, to divert cleaner hillside water into cloisters. Avoiding muddy communal streams, still, hydration failure had one ultimate consequence: outbreaks. Consider 1370s Paris, where chroniclers noted a summer of unrelenting heat. Wells dried. Breweries failed. Ale prices rose beyond reach. People, desperate, turned to the river again. Within weeks, diarrhea swept through poorer districts, killing infants and elders first. The city council issued orders not to wash animal hides in the river, but offered no alternative source of water in Florence. Records from the Orsan Michel charity house describe drought years when bread rations were accompanied by thin wine, because it was safer to drink than to let the throat parch. Even orphans received diluted wine twice daily, not for indulgence, but for survival. What did people do when there was nothing safe left to drink? They turned to faith. Churches organized blessing ceremonies at wells, where priests cast holy water into water, declaring it cleansed. Pilgrims made journeys to springs rumored to be miraculous, such as St. Winifred's Well in Wales, where the faithful bathed in freezing water to cure illness, fully believing what entered the skin could heal the belly. Some villages hung amulets above buckets, inscribing crosses onto wooden ladles to ensure safer scooping. Others recited simple prayers, whispered before each sip. It did not matter that the prayers held no scientific effect. What mattered was the sense of control. However small, yet despite illness, despite droughts and floods, hydration stability always returned. Grain shipments resumed. Breweries refilled their vats. Wells replenished with autumn rains, and soon, people forgot the danger until the next crisis. But this leads to an intriguing question. If people relied so heavily on ale and wine to stay alive, were they constantly drunk? Surely, one might picture medieval villagers stumbling through fields with tankards in hand, singing as they plowed. But was that truly the case? Or, as strange as it sounds, was medieval alcohol not intoxicating, but simply water in disguise? Chapter 3. When you imagine a medieval villager drinking ale from morning until night, you may picture a society in a perpetual haze, farmers slurring their speech behind plows, monks chanting slightly off-key, merchants haggling with exaggerated enthusiasm. After all, if alcohol replaced water, surely that meant everyone lived mildly or wildly intoxicated. Yet the truth is far more practical, far more controlled, and far more boring. Medieval ale was not like modern beer. It was weak, deliberate, and designed for hydration rather than celebration. Today, a standard beer might contain 4 to 6% alcohol by volume. Medieval small ale, the kind consumed daily by adults and children alike, typically ranged from 0.5% to 2%. A strength comparable to modern kombucha or kefir, not to a pub pint. It was liquid bread, brewed quickly, consumed immediately, and rarely aged. Most batches soured within days, forcing households to brew constantly or purchase fresh from local taverns or monastic breweries. Ale was brewed using large quantities of barley, oats, or wheat, boiled to sterilize the mixture, then cooled and fermented briefly with yeast. The result was cloudy, slightly sweet, and mildly tangy. It delivered calories, trace nutrients, and just enough alcohol to prevent bacterial growth, but not enough to dull the senses. Drinking dozens of cups of small ale in a day was not a celebration. It was hydration work. In household budgets, ale was classified not as a luxury, but as fuel. A medieval English knight might receive 8 pints per day as ration, yet still be expected to train, ride, and command with clarity. Monks in the Benedictine order were permitted about 4 pints daily, yet they were known as meticulous scribes, copying manuscripts with steady hands. Even children, from age 2 or 3, drank small ale with porridge, strengthening them through harsh winters. Of course, stronger drinks existed, and they absolutely were enjoyed, but their place in daily life was distinct and regulated. Strong ale or double beer was brewed longer, fermented deeper, and stored in barrels, rising to 4 to 8% alcohol content. This was reserved for holidays, harvest feasts, weddings, or payments to workers. A laborer hired to thresh grain or raise timber beams might receive a morning cup of weak ale, a midday cup of medium ale, and a final evening tankard of strong ale, balanced with bread, onions, and salted pork. Hydration came first. Celebration came later. In wine regions such as France, Italy, Spain, and the Rhineland, the same division applied. Everyday wine, ordinary or table wine, was rarely more than 2 to 3%. Medieval presses were less efficient, extracting less sugar, producing lighter ferments. Most wine was diluted with water, a practice adopted from Roman tradition, where drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric and uncivilized. Even children of noble households drank watered wine at breakfast, sometimes flavored with rosemary, cloves, or cinnamon, making it as much medicine as meal. The real danger lay not in drunkenness, but in shortage. Consider fasting days, of which there were many, sometimes over 180 per year for devout Christians. On these days, meat was forbidden, yet liquids were not. Monks and lay people alike relied on broths, thin beer, and pottage to sustain themselves without violating religious law. In monasteries, strong ale was technically banned, but medium ale, thick enough to nourish yet weak enough to remain pious, became the fuel of abstinence. Outside the cloister walls, hydration rituals took cultural shape in Scandinavia. Vikings and later Norse farmers drank gjøl brewed with juniper branches, yielding light but aromatic ale. In Ireland, even into the medieval era, milk-based drinks, such as bain clabber, soured milk, or whey water, were consumed alongside buttermilk ale. These offered hydration without intoxication, rooted in pastoral rhythms more ancient than Christianity. Meanwhile, in Islamic regions, where wine was prohibited by religious law, hydration developed along different scientific pathways. In medieval Baghdad or Cordoba, scholars recorded recipes for sharbat, cold drinks made from fruit syrups, vinegar infusions, or spiced waters. These were strained through cloth, filtered for clarity, and cooled with snow imported from mountaintops. Hydration was both ritual and refinement, demonstrating how technology and law shaped thirst differently across cultures. Yet across all regions, Christian or Muslim, northern or southern, urban or rural, hydration had one universal quality. It was communal. People rarely drank alone. Ale was poured from a shared jug, ladled from a common pot, sipped from a rotating cup, whether at home, farmstead, tavern, church hall, or worksite. To drink together was to affirm survival. To refuse a drink was to deny kinship. Hospitality was measured not by food first, but by how quickly the host filled your mug. But this raises a curious thought. If hydration was always shared, if trust in liquids was social before it was scientific, then did medieval people survive not only because of what they drank, but because of how they drank it? Modernity has solved hydration through pipes, purifiers, pumps, and plastic bottles. Yet it has also made it lonely. You drink from sealed containers, each serving measured, private, sterile. Nobody blesses your cup. Nobody inspects the well with you. Nobody hands you liquid as assurance of belonging. So perhaps the true secret of medieval hydration was not weak ale or boiled broth, not holy wells or careful tasters, but rituals of collective responsibility. If your neighbor brewed bad ale, you told him. If your village well tasted odd, you prayed together. If your monastery's ale ration ran low, you rationed as one body. Nobody survived hydration alone, and so one must ask, in an age where we have conquered disease and water, have we forgotten the humanity that once guarded it? And that's where we'll leave history for tonight. If you're still awake, thank you for spending this quiet time with me. I hope this little journey through the past helped your mind slow down. Even just a bit, if you'd like more calming stories like this, gently drifting through forgotten parts of history, I'd be grateful if you subscribed to Quiet Boring Sleep. It helps more sleepy people find their way here. And if you enjoyed tonight's slow wander through medieval hydration, maybe tap the like button before you drift off completely. Rest well, sleeper. I'll be here whenever you need another quiet story. Good night.